Yeah.
Professor Abhijit Banerjee. Professor Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the MIT. In 2003, he co-founded the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab with Esther Duflo and Sandil Mullarathan, and he remains one of the lab's director. Professor Banerjee is past president of Bureau of the Research and Economic Analysis Development, a research associate of NBER, a CEPR research fellow, international research fellow at the Kiel Institute, a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Econometric Society. He has been Guggenheim Fellow, an Alfred Sloan Fellow, and a winner of Infosys Prize. Professor Banerjee is author of large number of articles and 4 books, including Poor Economics, which won the Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year, and Good Economics for Hard Times, both co-authored with Esther Duflo. He is the editor of 3 more books and has directed 2 documentary films. Professor Banerjee has served on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda. He is a co-recipient of 2019 Sweriz's Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in Memorial Alfred Nobel for the groundbreaking work in development economics research. So good morning, everybody. If Professor Banerjee is already here, we will not like to waste his time. So straight away we go to the question. Professor Banerjee, the first question which is on the mind of everyone in India and abroad is, how badly has the COVID-19 impacted the Indian and global economy?
I think we know the statistics. The statistics are pretty dire for both for the world and for India, especially for India. India is among the worst performers in the world. Now, having said that, what is not so clear is what is the durable effect of this. Because, and the reason why that's a difficult question is because there is a sense in which the mechanisms through which India, a lot of people's earnings in India was generated are mechanisms of relatively short-term spending. India is an economy which has been driven a lot by consumer spending and real estate investment, both of which, if these revive, then you could imagine a lot of the same jobs coming back. So it's not, in other words, if the construction revives, then people will have to work there and people will have to migrate from from Bihar and West Bengal to Bombay to build those houses. And in Bombay, they make 250 to 400 rupees a day, and that's the source of prosperity for rural India. Very big part of earnings in rural India now comes from urban migrants. We have a data set where we looked at this, and the average daily earnings of a migrant when he's in the village is 1/12 of what he makes when he's not in the village. So it's an order of magnitude difference. So in some sense, I think so given that, it's not because these people have they were running large businesses that were shut down. The biggest shock comes from simply the fact that these people lost their entire livelihood, and that's a big part of the Indian economy now. The earnings of migrants and other temporary workers in general in the unorganized sector. So that seems to me to be both a general concern for the long run, but also maybe a little bit of a ray of hope for the short run, meaning that there isn't really anything very durable that has necessarily changed in the Indian economy. The Indian economy has its problems. I've written about it. I think the economy was slowing well before this happened. It has slowed for the last 5 years before this happened. And indeed, the data was showing that very clearly. But given all that, I would say that there isn't really a reason to assume that the 23% is going to be very durable. I think the economy is already reviving. You can see the FMCG spending is kind of going up quite fast. So I think we'll see a revival in this quarter. How much, I don't know, but certainly we won't be, year on year, we won't be anywhere near 23%.
Professor Banerjee, let's talk about impact of lockdown. Now, according to Professor Arun Kumar, whom perhaps you know, he is the chairman of the Institute of Social Sciences. He says almost 200 million people lost job in organized sector. Now, if you add the figures of unorganized sector, the number will go far higher. What do you think? Do you think these figures?
That number I find implausible. 200 million, there are not, according to other numbers, there aren't 200 million jobs in the organized sector. We say that 15% of our labor force is in the organized sector. If you think about how many people in the labor force, that's maybe 350 million people, 400 million people, but that's 15% of that number is more like 40 million than like 200 million. So I just don't think that order of magnitude number can possibly be right. It's clearly that number's 200 million people could not have lost their jobs. This is one of the few things I can say with some confidence in the organized sector. I just think that's inconsistent with what everybody's been saying, which is we don't have any jobs in the organized sector. So if 15% jobs are in the organized sector, they can't possibly be 200 million jobs lost.
Okay, now let's talk about the response of various governments. Now, stimulus announced by US government to the tune of almost $2 trillion, which is the highest since Second World War. The European Union has announced, I think, figure of about 750 million euros. The Indian government talked, yes, the Indian government talked about amount of 20 lakh crore, which is, I think, equivalent to roughly around $1 trillion. Now, recently, Professor Raghuram Raman has really advised that government must go in for more stimuli. He says if economy is like a patient on the bed, then you have to give some more sustenance to survive. So what is your view on this?
I guess I agree with him. I've been saying roughly the same thing. I do feel that our stimulus has been relatively limited in the sense that I think that if you think about what has been the big chunk of the stimulus, in a sense, it's a bank bailout. The banks, we have a public sector banking system which was lending to a bunch of people who were going to default on the loans. And so we have basically financially written off those and given that credit to the banks. But that's not increasing anybody's spending. That's in a sense, the banks are expected to be bailed out. So I don't think that there is anything that particularly happened to the spending. So I think that the first order need is to kind of increase consumer spending. And I think consumer spending, especially by the low income population. And there we have been much more conservative. We've not been really willing to spend a lot of money, putting money in the hands of the low income population. So in that sense, I don't see this as being, I don't think our stimulus was adequate to the need. I've said this before, I think we could do more.
Okay. Now, Professor Raghuram Raman also, you recollect 2-3 years back, has said Indian economy is like one-eyed king among the blind. The kind of contraction which we have seen, which figures are varying 15% to 23.9%. Now, do you think in 2021, India may not even remain the one-eyed king? It will much go down.
I think that so the question is a bit about, I think it's important to distinguish between catch-up and real growth. So I think we're going to actually see relatively, somewhere starting maybe in June to 2020, we're going to start to see a revival of the economy. So that's going to look like a fast growth, because if you take the beginning of the slump as being so if 2020 is going to be a bad year, so 2021 is going to be a better year than 2020, in that sense, the growth will look reasonable, because I think it's going to improve. The economy has been liberated from the lockdown. well, the question is more, will we go back to the will we be back at the pre-lockdown trend? Will we exceed the pre-lockdown trend? There's some, I think there are optimists who say that there was a lot of reforms that are going to be, now right now very controversial, labor market reforms and agricultural reforms, but maybe those will stimulate the economy. I have a hard time being able to tell exactly what part of that will have short-term stimulant effects, but I think that is an open range of possibilities. I think it's certainly the case that the growth in 2021 in India will look pretty decent, because I think we're going to be reviving from having lost something like 10% of GDP. So we're going to be reviving, so that revival is always relatively quick. The question is, can we cross where we would have been had the lockdown not happened? And I'm less optimistic about that.
Professor, please enlighten us how to look at the capitalism and globalization as we have understood for years. Because if we see the response of various governments which are pumping in money. These are the government which are saving companies, saving banks, creating jobs. Market forces are not doing anything. It's not the capitalism of past. Similarly, all countries are raising restrictions. They are raising barriers of tariffs and creating restrictions on imports and export and business. So do you think this globalization and capitalism have been impacted by COVID-19?
I think this is a pre-COVID-19 trend. I think that I think the demand for trade restrictions has been there for a while, and you start to see creeping trade restrictions right from the mid-2010s. I think that even from the last years of Obama's regime, you see a certain amount of willingness to go against the Chinese, and now you start to see that as being kind of a very strong trend in the US to just put tariffs on whatever they want to put. It's interesting, the WTO has now pronounced that a bunch of the US tariffs are illegal. The US has not actually budged. So we'll see what I think the real crisis is in the crisis of authority of the WTO. The WTO is one of the unique bodies in the world where it's one nation, one vote. Unlike the UN and a bunch of others, it's really like one of these. And so I think it's a key institution. In some sense, the US is very weak in WTO and it cannot bully it easily. So I think this is a very interesting moment. I feel that it's very important that the WTO holds the line and if necessary, finds way to be penal against the US, like it is. It's often penal against many countries, including India. I mean, the WTO finds countries, and countries mostly do cooperate with it, which is, I think, a very good sign of an institution. So I do feel that there is an important element of kind of a standoff going on right now. The US trying to bully the WTO to just allow it to do whatever it wants to do, and I think it's important that we hold the line. So I think this is sort of COVID-19. I think is I actually would say that at least the European community has shown a fair amount of, in my view, good judgment in being temporarily, I mean, the German central bank, famous for its conservative monetary policies, was very willing to allow the expansion you named, the 750 billion euros. That was the Germans and the French agreed on that. So I think they were, in a sense, did the right thing, which is, and I wouldn't call that seems to me to be recognizing the essentially Keynesian nature of all economies and not really on the question of whether it's capitalism or not. I think the really big threat to capitalism or global markets is coming from the assault on the WTO. And I think we really need to worry about that, because in a sense, then it's easy to drift into all kinds of places if there isn't really a strong commitment to WTO. So I think there are real risks in the economy, but I don't see the stimulus. I think was clearly a very sensible response to the kind of very harsh shutdowns that the economy has had to be, maybe that was the wrong policy, but whatever. Against COVID-19, they basically went for a very harsh shutdown, and the stimulus was kind of compensation for that.
Lord Meghnad Desai says that we may not admit we are virtually entering into some sort of Cold War. The kind of restrictions US is putting against Chinese companies, banning them, banning individuals, banning technologies, and making things difficult. Now, this is going to be, according to the biggest threat for recovery of the global economy. Now, today's Hindustan Times, the former Foreign Secretary of India, Mr. Shyam Saran, has written an op-ed, and he says same thing, that for recovery of the global economy, there has to be some minimal agreement between US and China. In 2007, 2008, when we had financial crisis, things were different. There was G20 could have some collaboration. But if the two top economies in the world are really not really cooperating each other, but fighting with each other, then how will the global economy recover?
It's a good question. I'm still optimistic. I feel that the US is so dependent on Chinese imports that it's going to be very hard, and this is sort of relevant for India. I just don't think that there is going to be major repositioning of US purchases. It's extremely difficult thing to do. And in particular, if the US puts pressure on China and you see a substantial depreciation of the Chinese currency, Chinese goods are going to be that much more attractive. So it's going to be, to me, quite unlikely that the US government will be able to constrain its own businesses from buying from China. So maybe yes. As I said, I think I'm more concerned about the institutional aspects of it, the signals sent by sort of WTO's authority being generally undermined, than by the US being able to stop, especially, I think the Chinese currency can lose a little bit and then it becomes even more competitive, and it's already very competitive. So I don't know how much this will actually pan out. I feel it's easy. We should hold our horses before pronouncing the end of globalization, good or bad.
So do you think countries like India can really replace China as a hub of supply chain? Because the emphasis on go local, vocal, and Atmanirbhar Bharat, do you think this is going to facilitate India's emergence as a supply chain player?
Well, Atmanirbhar Bharat is kind of, in a sense, I would say the key insight of 1991 was that certain inputs which we imported, and making those imports of those inputs very easy, like for example, all kinds of hardware and software, was critical to India's success in the 90s. The software boom comes partly out of being able to cheaply import computers and necessary software, and the price of computers came down massively in India. So those things are, I think one shouldn't, I think Atmanirbhar is a word that we need to be used carefully. I think it's a word that can be, we can imagine it being, we're going to source our own production. And right now, I think that would be exactly what we don't need to do. I think we need to be able to be competitive in the places we are good at, and to do that. And in a sense, I think there are going to be a bunch of moves towards AI, towards automatization more generally in the world. And if we want to be a player in that, we are not going to be the producer of the hardware. That's not what we are good at. So we better be not too obsessed with being Atmanirbhar. That's point number one. Point number two is, I still think that we are going to have a very hard time. We're sort of caught between the China on one side and Bangladesh and Vietnam on the other side, both of which are more nimble players than we have been for a while. So I think we are in a we're in a tight bind. So I'm not sure we can. And to be honest, our last many years of growth have been mostly domestic economy driven. We really are relatively when you can see that the stimuluses into the domestic economy had big effects on the domestic economy. We were relatively the capital markets are closed. We tend to basically look somewhat like a closed economy for many macroeconomic purposes, and as a result, we had a long period when we were growing fast. We had fair amount of inflation, and our government debt to GDP ratio was falling because of inflation. So we were basically doing that's a closed economic strategy of growth. You essentially close the capital markets, you don't let capital go out, and you use inflation to tax. That's something we have moved away from. Maybe that was a good thing to do. That was clearly a political priority for this government. But I think that means that we have traditionally been driven by domestic demand forces. And now we are sort of trying to move to international demand. We haven't positioned ourselves for it. So it's a good idea for the government to articulate that need, that we need to be globally more competitive. And we don't do that by emphasizing too much Atmanirbhar, because I think Atmanirbhar has the problem that we'll try to buy inputs domestically. That's to me is the wrong idea. We should specialize in what we're good at, import what we need to import, and go long on those.
Professor Banerjee, apart from infrastructure sector, which will include roads, ports, airports, smart cities, housing, water management, river cleaning, what are other sectors which government should be targeting to generate maximum possible jobs? Arun Maira, former member of Planning Commission, whom you might be knowing, he advised recently in an article that government should nurture growth of local economic ecosystems. What will you recommend for job creation?
I don't know the answer to that question. I feel like mostly, I mean, where even globally, the experience seems to be that creating hubs is mostly creating infrastructure. It's not clear that there is much else that generates, if you want to create large businesses, it's not clear that you do it by much else. A place where we have intervened on and off and in a sense patchily is in capital markets. So you have we have evidence suggesting that our intervention in capital markets are actually relatively successful, in the sense that when the priority sector expands, the businesses that benefited from it have high rates of return. But that's a place where we have gone back and forth. We have not really been very confident about it. So if you had to take one other direction you could think that it's, basically do what the Chinese did, which is to reallocate finance. This was a big part of Chinese growth for a long time, to allocate capital and finance it's a dangerous strategy. We sort of have seen the pitfalls of it. We have huge bad debt, and partly, but a lot of that, I would say, comes from large-scale corporate borrowing. The big companies are the real villains of that story, of the story of our the NPAs. A lot of them come from very big companies who have almost ruthlessly manipulated that system of borrowing from public sector banks and defaulting, and sort of very clientelist relationship. So I feel that a little bit we've been bitten by that. We haven't really created a great infrastructure for small entrepreneurs to flourish, in the sense that we don't the priority sector credit has been kind of allocated and reallocated, is expanded and shrunk. It's not been a very solid commitment to them. So maybe that's a direction. Our research suggests that may be a direction to do with more focus, and really, but that will require a kind of a first order change in how the banks operate. The banks are right now frozen by the extent of their NPAs, and so it's not an easy thing to call up, because the banks themselves are in such a mess, to be honest. And so I feel that this is not I can say this, it's cheap to say, but it's not clear that there is any immediate action available.
Well, let us go back a little bit. By hindsight, would you say demonetization was a bad idea, or it was a good idea implemented badly? Is the Indian economy still suffering from the negative consequences which might have been triggered off by demonetization?
That's a harder question. I would say I said then, not just in hindsight, but even in then, that there was no particular argument for it as I saw it, and I still don't think there was an argument for it. I've sort of always taken the view that this was an experiment that I think we kind of should have thought harder about before. I mean, I think the goal of kind of fighting black money is a noble goal, and I support it. But I think that the extent to which our economy is cash-based, and especially the unorganized sector's cash-based, makes it very fragile. It really makes it extremely hard for people to negotiate suddenly losing their cash. And it clearly had a substantial negative effect when it happened. How long it lasted? I mean, I would say probably, I think the bigger, so I'll say something else. I'm not sure that the slowdown in growth comes as much from demonetization as it comes from the policy on sort of the terms of trade moving against agriculture, the fact that the MSP was capped. Those things are basically the anti-inflationary push. My view, I've always taken the view that this is a view that's not popular with almost any of my serious macroeconomics colleagues, but I think India benefited a lot from being on a relatively high inflation, stable high inflation path. We really, despite what Milton Friedman said, we really had 20 years of high inflation, high growth. It was, and stable. Inflation was not going to 1,000,000%. It was 10% or somewhere around there. It was stable. It was I think whatever macroeconomists say, I don't think it looked like it was about to spin out of control. It was just high inflation. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's a different question, because that, of course, means that we are stealing from all the savers. Basically, the savers where people have money in the bank, put their money in the bank, their interest rates were being taxed by the inflation. So there's legitimate debates on it, but I think our growth strategy was very much a kind of closed economy with lots of government creating lots of demand, and that demand was driving both inflation and growth. And we sort of moved away from that. We moved away from that with a much more anti-inflationary government and a much more fiscally conservative government. And my sense is that might be a bigger issue than the demonetization. I would have thought that we would have revived from demonetization. It's hard to tell. These are sort of reading tea leaves. It's not what I do usually for a living, but because it's It's one demonetization. So we don't know what, how much it did and didn't do.
Professor Banerjee, NDA government has announced a number of pro-poor schemes, Jan Dhan Yojana, so many other schemes of financial inclusion. Now, how many people might have been brought above the poverty line? Because many of these schemes are really targeting alleviation of poverty.
I have no idea. I mean, there's no point. I mean, because I think this is a period where, if you look at the record, the record is actually, for the first time, we see in the NSS, I think between 2014 and 2017, the per capita consumption is flat, slightly declining. So that's the average people, and correspondingly, poverty is drifting up. That data has been, now disavowed. So you could say that maybe that data was wrong, but I don't think the data was any more wrong than any previous. It was the same bad or same, so whatever. It looked pretty convincing that the economy had stopped, but I think a lot of that is related to what I'm saying. In a sense, the stimulus-driven economy, you take stimulus away, wage growth falls, and you get a slowdown. And I don't know how much of it's just that. It's these things are, there's so little. We especially, I think it's sad that we sort of have disavowed the NSS but not have replaced it or improved it, and we sort of don't really have enough data coming in, so it's hard to know exactly what's going wrong. And I think that's a pity, because India is a country which has had just a heroic history of being the world leader in producing data. We were the first, and the NSS is the world's first large-scale survey of its kind anywhere. We were the world leader. I think we should just take pride in how much, just how remarkably advanced we were in producing data, and put lots more effort into that. So right now it's hard to tell what's going on.
Professor, would you say that criteria for measuring poverty need to be relooked? It should be changed, or we should really examine it? Because $1.50 for meeting all the needs for individual, he may survive, but he really not living a healthy life. So do you think that measuring poverty on the basis of how many calories intake one person takes, that could be much more realistic to assess how many people are poor, how many people are not poor?
I think I think I would go the other way. In fact, I think the calorie was a good measure when we were like super poor, when the real constraint was enough food. Now, my sense is that, leaving out COVID-19, we really are much less, that's much less of an issue than, I would say, being able to afford all the things we now think are, being able to, whatever, educate your children, live in a house with a toilet, and there's lots of, the expectations have also shifted. So I do think that, assuming we get out of this crisis right now is probably not the right time, because we'll see huge increase in poverty. But I think if we start growing well, I think we should go back to revising the poverty line. We already revised it. In a sense, nowadays, a lot of us use sort of $2 a day rather than $1 a day. But I would say move up. I think we should have higher expectations than that. So I agree with the spirit of your question.
Professor, do you think hunger is a problem in India? Government claims that nobody goes hungry in India, but many of government detractors won't agree.
So you do see, so I'll tell, I think that the very poorest, leave out COVID-19. I think during COVID-19, hunger was a problem. It was absolutely a problem. People, migrants in the city, didn't have access to any way of paying for their food, and they were lining up in the soup kitchens and the langar khanas and everywhere else, and so I think there was hunger. But I think let's take that out of the conversation, because I think that was a moment where we were a bit all paralyzed. We didn't really have enough. I think we didn't understand what was going on. None of us. I'm not saying the government. I didn't understand what's going on. So I think the whole thing was a bit too fast, too much, too fast. I think, but I think looking at the data, we've been looking at. I guess the last round of data we collected was 2017, and in that data, the fraction who say they have skipped a meal in the last month is still 40%. This is among the poor, among the very poor. But among the very poor, there are people, to take the bottom 10%. In the bottom 10%, I think skipped a meal once or more in last month. The answer is yes for 40%. 60% say they haven't skipped a meal. So I think that number is a reasonable number. So I don't know whether that's the bottom 10%. That's why I was saying that I would love to get us collecting better data rather than saying our data is bad. I think it's really important that we have data that we can rely on, because we need to know this answer to this. It can't just say be a he said she said story. So I want the data, but I think that our data suggests that the bottom 10% or something, this is an issue.
What do you think have been the major reasons of farmers' distress in India? Some of them, you must have read papers every year. So many farmers commit suicide. Recently, there's some agitation going on. Would you suggest some doable practical measures which could alleviate farmers' distress?
Well, I think there are three pieces to that, and one piece is temporary, which is, and I'm not sure. I think that this current debate about the agricultural marketing reforms, that to me is I actually don't fully understand what the exact risks are. So I'm going to leave that out of the table. Okay, so off the table, because I'm still studying it, and the bill is complicated, but it's not obvious to me that that is as much as a disaster as some people are feeling. So I think there is some need for reform, and maybe this is the wrong reform, but I think clearly we set up a system when we were food scarce, and we now are dealing with a situation where we are food exporter, and I think we need to, and we are sort of, on the other hand, we're running out of water. I mean, we need to manage a better transition in agriculture. I think that's clear that we have sort of, we need to do certain things about the pricing and the incentives in agriculture, which one way or the other have to be done. Now, before that, I think there were two things going on. One was credit. I think we have almost no insurance for agricultural disasters. In the US, for example, farmers are farm insurance is a very big deal in the US. And we don't have really much of any. So, when you get locusts coming to your field, you borrowed money, you grew something, it got eaten by the locust, you're sort of out of luck, and there's no policy frame for it. We're sort of starting to try to build a policy frame for it. This government has paid attention to it, but it's going to take a long time to build, and the private companies are not that keen to participate in it. So the agricultural insurance piece is a very important one. And if I had to pick one thing, I would do that. And then there is finally the political question of terms of trade, where we have sort of moved the terms of trade against agriculture, partly by choice. So as Ashok Gulati points out, that so I think that there is really three different pieces to that story. And I'm personally, I think designing a working market for agricultural insurance is going to be critical, and we haven't managed yet, in my view.
Well, Professor, we are coming to the last question, which is not related to economics. You must have read in papers recently announced national education policy, which has been hailed as maybe a big game changer, which can change the education system in India for the better. You have been associated with education for last so many decades. What are your thoughts about India's newly announced education policy?
Well, there's so many pieces to it. Let me not try to comment on everything. Let me comment on one piece, which is sort of related to my own work, which is the piece about what you should try to do for the first 5 years, from kindergarten to, or whatever, to from, class -3 to class 2, basically. So what are we supposed to do about that? And that's a I'm sorry. Some has a life of its own. So it's in there. I would say that the basic idea that by third class 3, people should have basic competencies down, the basic math and reading down. I think, to be honest, people have criticized that. They criticize it for being not ambitious enough. On the other hand, we know I worked with the assert data with Pratham for now 20 years, and I would say that the data suggests that we can be ambitious, but then we don't realize it. We don't do it. We don't have the systems on the ground to actually deliver. We promise a lot and then not deliver. That seems to be the way it's gone. So I don't mind saying that we'll set the first years to just build a base. I think that that's if we can do that. I really do think that what is critical is what happens, the transition from that to teaching content. So I think it's fine to not teach content in class 1. Maybe it's okay for people to just focus on basic skills and build up basic skills till they are 7 or something, and then start to learn content. And I don't think that's a bad idea. I think I'm sort of sympathetic to this, but I think what is really important is to notice that ambition has been built off the fact that we have generally failed to do that. 50% of children in class 5 cannot do second grade arithmetic. That's the fact from assert year after year. So I feel that given that, it's important that we recognize that we're going to fail also. Even though our goal is to get them all up and running by class 3, we'll fail. So then we have to think of what to do about that. So we have to build a system that's much more robust, which goes back to them and say, look, yes. And there, I think the work that Pratham has done, for example, and other approaches as well, to make sure that nobody remains there. So it's not that we say that, in class 3, if you haven't learned to read, that's it. Now we're going to go to physics, and you're going to, you're going to study nuclear physics now. We have to somehow create transitions and be mindful of the fact that this system will fail. Even the new system will fail. And we need to, let's say 30% can't read in class 3. We need to then have mechanisms for those 30% to have very quick catch up. And we do have those mechanisms. The sort of Pratham's work is very importantly highlighting those mechanisms and how one does it. But I think we shouldn't create a new ideal and say that, this system will solve all the problems. I like the focus on basic skills, but I worry that we should not just articulate it, we should implement it. We should be mindful that we're going to fail in part, and then we need to do something about it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your very, very frank, candid, and insightful replies. I will urge my all attendees here to give a virtual round of applause to Professor Banerjee. And we are left with a few minutes. I think we can take a few questions, Professor, if you don't mind.
No worries.
I see the hand raised by our friend Suresh Goyal. Are you there, Suresh?
Yep.
And then
Surendra,
go ahead, make very brief question.
very brief. I don't think I need to speak for a long time. Sir, thank you very much for lovely conversation. My question really is related to this debate going on in India. Driver of economy, economic stimulus, market or consumption? I'm sorry, consumption or production? And number two, what do you think about deficit financing?
I guess I've been arguing for deficit financing. That's sort of what I've been saying, that we need more stimulus, and more stimulus right now is not going to come from more taxes, since taxes are have cratered. So therefore, it has to come from more deficit financing, and especially in a situation where we are in a big deep slump. I would say deficit financing is a good idea to do more of. On the production versus consumption, I think in the short run, we'll have to do consumption. Production will take time to build, at best. We hope. I'm all for the view that we should improve the production or production economy, but it's not one that it's not been easy so far. It's not going to happen in a day.
I see the face of former Home Secretary Sri K. Padmanabhan sir, Hyderabad. So would you like to ask some question?
Hello.
Hello. You have to put your mic, your audio is on mute.
Mute.
Yes.
No, Surinder, I have no questions. I have enjoyed his talk. And yes, as you said, he has been very candid and wonderful responses. So thank you.
Thank you.
I also see among the participants, Professor Amitabh Mattu from JNU. Professor Mattu, are you still there? I think he's perhaps left.
No, he's here. I see him.
Yeah.
Professor Mattu.
Yeah.
Professor Mattu, would you like to ask question to your former colleague?
No, I mean he never taught in JNU, but he is a legend in JNU because of being a student who broke all academic records. But that is now, of course, part of history. The question that I had to ask was really an out-of-the-box question. If the government of India invited Dr. Banerjee to come and advise it right now, unlikely as it may seem, would he consider coming back to advise for a short term?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly consider it. I'm very much a I would say patriot is a disputed word, but someone who has Indian welfare at heart. So yeah, I would consider it. I mean, I think it would have to be in a situation where I feel that I would be listened to. That's the. But I think there are important things that need to be ironed out, where whatever ideological differences have, we could set them aside and work together. I think there are
among the participants, I see Ambassador Dev Mukherjee. Ambassador Dev Mukherjee has been studying Professor Banerjee for many years. Ambassador Dev Mukherjee would like to ask something. I think he's not interested. We have former DG of BSF, Sri Mahend Kawat from Jaipur. He wants to ask a question. Please unmute. You are on the mute. The red microphone thing, press it and become unmute.
Yeah.
Yes, now go ahead.
I would like Professor Banerjee to comment on unemployment situation that we have in our country. In a backward district like Dungarpur, for last 4 days, just for 1,000 posts, there was curfew in that area for 3 to 4 days. Number of vehicles were burnt, and the people are all looking for jobs, and jobs are nowhere to be seen. And just for 1 lakh vacancies, which Railway announced 2.5 crore people applied. I am former chairman of Public Service Commission Rajasthan. In these backward states like Rajasthan, UP and Bihar, most people look for government jobs. They are just not there. And private jobs are also not available. So what is your view on that or take on that? How the situation is going to improve or whether it will further deteriorate? Thank you.
You know, I'm going to say something extremely controversial on this one. I think our public sector jobs are, in a sense, too good. I think people are too obsessed by it. We have data showing that young people in India, if you take the people who have more than 10 years of education, at ages 26, 27, they're not working. What are they doing? They're taking courses, they're taking exams, competitive exams, and that's a quarter of the labor force. There's 25% of those people. That's too many people waiting for a job. By the time they're 32, 33, they all accept jobs. The unemployment rate is much, much lower. Right now, of course, everything is high, but still, if you look at the people who are over 30, they take some job. So a lot of these people are just obsessed by public service commission jobs, if you forgive me for saying that. I think we need to make those jobs less lucrative. And I had a suggestion, I've said this, I've written about this, so I can say it, which is that we should say for any public sector job, you're going to have a period of 5 years where you are paid a stipend and we look at performance. And then after that, you can get the job. You take the exam. After the exam, you are in, and that's going to make people go to the private sector because they're going to now think that, okay, these jobs are too difficult to get. So I do feel that we need to change the culture of public sector jobs. Not, I think, cut jobs. I'm not at all for shrinking the public sector. I think in India we need a large public sector. Partly, I think we are. If I think compare with China, every village has at least 2 people with bachelor's degrees working for the government. Every village, they really have built the whole system is built on the ground. There are people with good education who are doing things, and we really need. So I'm not somebody who says that we should just get rid of the public sector. That's not my view at all. But I do think that the jobs are too attractive. They need to be made less attractive. And the way to do it is to have this apprenticeship to build into these jobs.
Among the participants, is former Foreign Secretary Kamal Sibal is still there. Sir, are you there? No, I also see the face of Dr. Ajay Kumar Singh from Bangalore. Do you want to ask something? Your microphone, press it. The red thing will turn into white.
Mr. Surendra Kumar, can I ask a question?
Just a minute. Let Ajay do it, and next you are Dr. Okay, in the meantime, Dr. Sarvjit can go ahead. Sarvjit. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Professor, Research Society of Capitalism. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody can hear. Go ahead.
Yeah, crony capitalism, where we are trying to make everything a privatization. Dr. Manmohan Singh started it to some extent. Now it is almost 100% capitalism. Crony capitalism. How we will evaluate? It's in the interest of people where more than 80% of people are below poverty line. What's your opinion about it?
Specifically, I don't think, I think 80% of your poverty line is pretty high. I'm not disagreeing, but I don't think it's the official poverty line. But then getting to the chronic, I think that I would say I think what we've learned from the recent experience of the banks is that the banks keep lending, and we pointed this out. I pointed this out in a piece I wrote, I'm going to say in 2001 or 2, that banks keep lending to people, and then one day they say, oh my God, this guy is defaulted. I mean, you know, it's not like this was, you can see that this firm is not doing well, it's not selling anything, it's not, you know, it's losing money, but you sit on your hands till one day it defaults. And this has been our experience. Now, of course, the firms are also clever. They doctor their books, they make it look like they're making money. But I think that we're really, I feel that we are often, when somebody has a good connection or a good name, or we give them too much license. I mean, most of the problems we have come from big businesses defaulting. I mean, that's really, I mean, it's true that there are some issues with, you know, some of the NBFCs, but I think the big problem with the big banks come from big businesses. And so I think we do have a problem of crony capitalism.
Well, to finish on time, Professor, I will take just one more question, and the last question goes to my dear friend Neelam Savarwal. Neelam, go ahead. First, unmute your thing, and then you ask question. Yes, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Well, it's really a privilege, I think, to have heard, I think, from such close quarters, Professor Banerjee. Thank you very much. There was a great deal to learn, and I don't know, as really a layman, if one could, you have touched supply chains, you have, you know, touched on the labor and the farm sector reform and so on. May I just sort of put somewhat not very bright question, but in a sense, I felt that, you know, the lockdown, the COVID, this huge crisis has also been a kind of a steep learning curve for us, I think, or should be. I mean, in a sense, we have in governance, in healthcare, in disaster management, in finally, of course, in this huge crisis of the migrants. Now, we are talking of, you know, positioning ourselves in these supply chains, and we talk of diplomatic initiatives and summits and so on, which I'm not going to do it. We'll have to first empower ourselves to be ready for these supply chains. So do you think it sounds too theoretical if one was to postulate that this is the period in which, you know, the government could have sort of set up a number of teams to really look at the MSME sector, the sort of the labor reform? Of course, we are seeing the disaster in the farm sector, which is by itself not so bad, but probably the manner has been such that you know, the differentiated scene in the country didn't really make this possible. So do you think these are would this be a way that, you know, the sort of teams could work out some blueprints with suggestions, so by the time we really come out, that we could perhaps come out with some viable strategies?
Okay,
otherwise, yeah.
Let Professor answer your question.
So it's a good question. I think you're right that the government has, in a sense, it's an opportunity. Every crisis, in a sense, offers an opportunity to, and the government has focused. I mean, to give it credit, it has tried to make certain changes. Whether I always agree with the changes or not, it's clearly has taken the view that we need to make changes. I think that the MSME sector is one where I think we don't have a very good diagnosis even of why our MSMEs don't grow. It's been noted for a long time. We are among the smallest firms in the world, and why our firms don't grow is something that, you know, people have thought about. I've thought about it, but to be honest, I must say that I haven't really. In the end, I don't have a great answer to that question. So I think you're right that we should be. That's a very important part, is because in a sense, the flip side of crony capitalism is that banks also feel, oh, who could I lend to? Because the small firms are so small, I don't want to lend to them, and that's a real problem with our ecosystem.
Professor, if you don't mind, I see the hand from a JNU student called Anjali. If you can spare 1 minute, I can give her a chance.
Sure. Please.
Okay, Miss Anjali, go ahead. You wanted to ask something. Miss Anjali, you were sending your message that you want to ask question.
Good evening, sir. I hope I will not take a lot of your time. I remember you talking about the transition that is required in the educational field of ours, especially when we were talking about the Indian educational system. I just want to know the impact of COVID-19, what it has had in the education policy, and what is the current situation. How do you think the transition is going to be smooth? How do you think it is going to impact the young minds, and how do you think the transition, whatever we have had till now in the education policy, is going to impact the current scenario of ours?
I think that's a very good question, a very worrying issue, because I think that we have some data. I think best data is actually interesting from Pakistan on this, on what happens when students have large enforced breaks. And you can see that the inequality goes up massively. The poor children just drop out of the education system. They lose all connection to it. Schools are very important for the poor, less important for the middle class children, because their parents are going to keep pursuing ye padho, ye karo. There will always be Zoom, this and that. They'll find something. It's the poor children who really suffer, and I think we need to confront that. I'm actually worried that nobody in India is seriously talking about opening schools. And I realize there are risks there, but it's at least something to bring on the table. I do feel that there is lots of danger in just letting the school system slide away and lose a whole year.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. It has been an honor, privilege, and a pleasure to have you amongst us. We really admire that you have covered so many things in less than 45 minutes with so many questions, different issues. And we hope when next time you come to India, we can have you in some hall. So not on virtual discussion, but we can have real discussion.
I want to be in a hall. I'm done with this Zoom.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Pleasure meeting you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to you.
Thank you so much.